On February 24, 2022, that is this year, when Russia launched a special operation against Ukraine, everyone, including the Americans and us Indians, expected Kyiv to capitulate before the Russian military might in a matter of days. After all, the Russian offensive began with over 300 standoff ballistic and cruise missile strikes targeting Ukrainian early warning air defense radars, the S-300 air defense systems, and airfield infrastructure. This was a classic textbook attack, and it was expected that the VKS, the latest branch of his military formed on 1st August 2015 with the merging of the Russian Air Force and the Russian Aerospace Defense Forces, to follow up with relentless air raids backed by its state-of-art fighters. The logic would have been that the VKS would have established air superiority over the much smaller Ukrainian Air Force and paved the way for the ground force to move in with thunder. Well, 8 months into the war in Ukraine, Russia's military failure is forcing strategists across the world to ask the most troubling questions since the age of horse-powered militaries. The Russian Air Force, renamed VKS, or let's say the Air and Space Forces in 2015, was meant to spearhead Russia's Ukraine campaign. Its failure poses hard questions for the Indian Air Force, not only because it operates an overwhelmingly made-in-Russia fleet, but because of fundamental issues to do with the changing nature of air warfare. Looking at the numbers in February, when Russia launched massive strikes to destroy Ukrainian Air Force on ground and obliterate its air defenses as well as command sectors, victory seemed inevitable. Compared to the 772 fighter jets operated by the Russians, the Ukrainians had only about 69 operational fighters. The difference in the number of attack helicopters operated by the two countries was 544 and 34, and dedicated ground attack aircraft 739 and 29. The two sites operated almost similar equipment. 1100 missiles, including the KH-101 cruise missiles deployed from the Tu-95 and the Tu-160 bombers, the heaviest in the VKS fleet, hit Ukraine in just first 10 days of the war. The number of cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles fired at Ukraine more than tripled by August to 3,650. Several times the size of India's entire conventional arsenal. The Russian missile and precision munition attacks hit an estimated 90% of the targets, but did nothing to degrade the Ukrainian air defenses or command centers. Targeted runways came back in operation inside hours. Kyiv held out against the Russian army. The fighting in eastern Donbass in eastern Ukraine degenerated into a rocket and artillery slogging match. The reasons why things didn't go according to the VKS plan are becoming clearer now. For one, the Russian manufactured and supplied long-range S-300 surface-to-air missiles, the medium-range Buk M1, and the short-range, the SA-8 Gecko systems proved significant deterrent to the VKS air missions. The Russia-Ukraine war has shown that aerial warfare has changed from close kinetic to beyond visual range, where sensors, advanced ISR radars, and long-range missiles come into play, besides electronic warfare capabilities that can jam enemy radars and spoof incoming missiles. Trouble for Russia was that it operates a relatively small fleet of manned combat support platforms such as the Airborne Early Warning and Control, Electronic Warfare, and the Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance aircraft for supporting precision strike and other missions. There's a huge capability gap in the C4ISR, that is the Command, Control, Communications, Computers, Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, besides of course electronic warfare, target acquisitions, stealth, targeting, precision-guided weapons, and other relevant areas between the VKS and the leading Western air forces. When Russia launched its missile blitzkrieg, it was following the Western Air Force's doctrine. Maximilian K. Bremer, the director of the Special Programs Division at the Air Mobility Command of the US Air Force, and Kelly A. Greco, a resident senior fellow with the New American Engagement Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scofford Center for Strategy and Security, noted that these founding fathers of air power theory championed winning and maintaining command of the air, or in today's doctrine, air supremacy. This was to have command of the air means to be in a position to prevent the enemy from flying while retaining the ability to fly oneself. But the Russia-Ukraine war has raised questions against this Western doctrine of air control or air supremacy, which is also followed by the Indian Air Force. So the question is whether air dominance is necessary or air denial. If you take a futuristic war with China, both India and China will see a very contested space, and neither country would be able to establish full air control of the other. Bremer noted that it would be foolish to think that the air domain and air power is less relevant to future wars, or that Russian ineptitude renders lessons about air power's role unhelpful. He argued that far from irrelevant, control of the air domain was the battle's center of gravity. By adopting an air denial strategy, that is, maintaining an air defense in being to keep Russia's manned aircraft at bay and under threat, Kiev thwarted Russia's ability to not only ascertain the disposition of the Ukrainian forces, but also to respond rapidly to events once it became obvious where the counterattacks were taking place. Quite simply, air denial, not the traditional concept of air superiority, was a prerequisite for Ukraine's battlefield success, he analyzes. Sources in the Indian defense establishment said that the future wars will not only be won by the side which fires first at the enemy, but also the one who spotted the enemy first. And this is where the Russian Air Force, more oriented as a defensive force rather than one able to carry out large-scale offensive operations, found its challenge. The S-300 air defense system, even if 2 generations behind the current S-500, is a formidable deterrent for the Russian fighters. To make things worse, the VKs began to rapidly deplete its limited stockpile of precision-guided munitions, which Russian factories had ceased to produce in 2014 due to Western sanctions, because many of them actually used Western components. The VKs responded to the subsequent shortage of precision-guided munitions with low-level ground attack missions, only to find itself confronted with a lethal hail of the US-supplied Stinger shoulder-fired missiles and the British-manufactured Starstreak, besides the Soviet-manufactured Igla systems. The Indian defense establishment sources pointed out that the war has exposed the Russian fighters lacked the ability of modern electronic warfare and also the capability to fight beyond the visual range, forcing them to come within the bubble of Ukrainian air defense systems. Countries like the US and China have specialized multiple electronic warfare aircraft that fly with their combat jets to jam and spoof enemy radars and air defense systems. Estimates of VK's losses run up to 175 destroyed and 68 captured aircraft, including several of the state-of-the-art, the Su-34 heavy fighters, each estimated to cost an estimated $35 million. But if the Ukrainians have air defense systems, so do the Russians, and more lethal ones at that. What helped the Ukrainians were the anti-radiation missiles fitted on their MiG-29 jets by the US military technicians, which enabled them to blind Russian air defenses. It gave the Ukrainian Air Force a potent counter-punch as the missile homes in on radiation transmissions at about 3,200 kilometers per hour, either obliterating Russian radars or forcing them to shut down to avoid detection. According to the sources, early setbacks and failure of the original Russian thinking that Kiev will drop arms led to a weakened morale within the Russian military when the Ukrainians did not and fought back. Another issue with the Russians, the sources said, was the over-dependence on attack helicopters. The Russians did not learn the lessons from Afghanistan experience where they lost over 300 helicopters due to Stingers. The same thing happened in Ukraine where they were shot down easily by shoulder-fired missiles. Their doctrine should have changed. So remember that while helicopters are useful, they cannot fly within the bubble of a Stinger. In Ukraine, the Russian attack helicopters suffered severe losses for little gain. The US Army, as it considers replacement for its OH-58 and the OH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, is exploring platforms that can fly fast at below radar detection level instead of high and slow like the current set of helicopters. Remember that long before the Ukrainian war realized the limitations of Russian technology, India had moved to fit its Russian made Su-30 fleet with Israeli electronic warfare suits. Following the air battle after the Balakot strike, where the Su-30 MKIs were outmatched by the Pakistani F-16s with long-range AMRAAM missiles, India also sought to retrofit Israeli-made Derby missiles to the aircraft. And the IF has long been seeking more Western-made aircraft like the state-of-the-art Rafale. There's a clear thinking within the Air Force that they don't want any more Russian fighters. Fundamental issues, though, have been raised in the course of the war that go far beyond the shopping that the IF needs to do. For generations, air power was available only to nation states with either large technological industrial infrastructure or deep pockets. In Ukraine, the war has lifted the curtain on a world where air power has become democratized and called into question the whole idea that traditional air forces can win air superiority. The unlikely war-winning weapon in the Ukraine war was built around technology that can be bought off the shelf. The Ukrainian armed forces are now reported to be operating over 6,000 small drones, mainly derived from commercial use variants. Ranging from staging precision strikes on Russian armor to providing long-range artillery exact coordinates, the drones have played havoc with the famed Russian military strategy and might. Even though drones like the much celebrated Turkey-made Baratkar, the TB2, are more vulnerable to the traditional air defenses than propaganda videos suggest, it is besides the point. The TB2 is cheap at well under 5 million each and easy to replenish since it uses components also manufactured for commercial aerospace applications. Future air wars, expert Peter Wilson speculated, might see robotic systems occupying an even larger role, especially in hazardous ground support missions to hover over targets unseen. Loitering munitions are cheap and very deadly. India has pumped funding into drone development with homegrown firms like the New Space and IdeaForge working on everything from drone swarms, autonomous wingmen, and surveillance. But the Indian military procurement systems are slow, and experts have warned that the acquisitions are often left behind by technological change. There isn't a well-developed domestic aerospace ecosystem in India either, nor the kind of deep public-private partnership model which grew Turkey's defense sales from $1 billion in 2002 to $11 billion last year. Even as it grapples with these larger challenges, the Air Force also confronts some of hard short-term realities. For one, Indian munition stockpiles are nowhere near those needed for the kind of grinding conflict seen in Ukraine. According to some, India has already taken steps in the wrong direction. Last month, the Air Force raised its first squadron of the indigenously made light combat helicopter. The Army also has plans to induct several more attack choppers. These helicopters could very well become easy targets for shoulder-fired missiles on the line of actual control between India and China. Air Marshal Deeptendu Chaudhary, the former commandant of the National Defense College, argued that the core problem was that Russia failed to reform its thinking to engage with a changing military landscape. The transformation of the VKS was limited to organizational restructuring and superficial changes. There have not been independent doctrinal changes, he said. Bremer's message to the US Air Force is something that the Indian Air Force should also ponder on. He is of the opinion that the USAF, instead of insisting on expensive and exquisite capabilities such as next-generation fighter jets and stealth bombers to conduct deep strikes and pulsed operations, ought to move more rapidly towards unmanned and autonomous systems and swarming tactics with thousands of small and cheap drones. Otherwise, the Air Force runs serious risk of repeating Russia's mistakes by holding tight to a force structured center predominantly on manned aircraft, creating a situation where the force is too costly to risk and too small to sustain losses during a prolonged war of attrition, he said. So are commercial dual-use technologies like those powering drones and precision satellite imagery going to prove just as able as exquisite and fantastically expensive cutting-edge military equipment? Will new anti-aircraft weapons render conventional combat aircraft irrelevant? Could advances in robotics make manned air forces a thing of the past? Well, these are some of the questions that India, and more specifically the Indian Air Force, should dwell on. Well, this is Snehesh Alex Philip for The Print. Do subscribe to our Print's YouTube channel for more such videos.